Welcome back, everyone. Today's guest is a really special one, Dr. Norman Naimark. He's a professor of history at Stanford University and is also affiliated with the Hoover Institution. He is an expert on genocide, particularly genocide in Eastern Europe during the post-World War II period. I think he's particularly relevant today, given the recent reports of the violence and murders that occurred in Bucha. We're going to ask a lot of the hard questions about whether or not these acts of violence are deeply rooted and have a pattern throughout not just Soviet history and post-Soviet history, but also have roots stretching back farther than that. We're also going to ask the questions about whether or not these were just random acts of violence, or whether or not there was a specific pattern throughout Soviet and Russian history that tends to lead to these sorts of events, given the way that the other may be demonized. I don't know how these questions are going to be answered or what Dr. Naimark's take will be, but I really hope that it's an enlightening, interesting, and sobering episode. And just, be forewarned, some of the things that we could be discussing might be disturbing, could be graphic. So just come in with an open mind and steel yourself for some of these tough questions. Thank you for supporting this podcast, and I hope you'll like and subscribe this episode and be around to see many more. Welcome back, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Norman Naimark. Norman, or Professor Naimark.
You can call me Norman, please.
Thank you very much for coming on this show. You're doing me and the audience a tremendous honor, and I hope that they cherish the fact that you could be on any number of stations right now, and you chose this one. As being a former student, I know I got a bit of an advantage, so I appreciate that. So recently, we saw atrocities in Bucha in Ukraine, and the reason I wanted to bring you on is you are an expert on genocide, particularly in the kind of Eastern European experience. So before we start delving into some of the kind of Russian-centric questions, how would you define genocide?
Well, the definition of genocide is not a really straightforward one, but people have come up with one centered around the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. So December 1948, and that definition says essentially that genocide is the intentional destruction of all or part of a nation, religious group, ethnic group, as such. And what this means is you're not just killing members of a group, but you're trying to eliminate that group as a group. That's why that as such at the end is important. So the idea of genocide, again, think about the classic cases of the Jews, the Second World War, or the Armenians in the First World War. I mean, the idea in both of those cases was to eliminate those groups as groups, period, right? No more Armenians, no more Jews. You don't have to kill everybody, but you do need to sort of attack the group as a unified group and destroy its ability to act as a group. So that's the basic definition of genocide. Again, you have ethnic, racial, religious, or national groups. Those are the four categories of groups that are mentioned in the convention. I mean, we could go on with the definition, what's wrong with it, what's right with it, but surrounding that definition is the way that contemporary historians and also, by the way, the international justice system works. So the international justice system has updated that definition of genocide. I'll give you one quick example. For example, in Rwanda, the courts that met about Rwanda decided that mass rape and systematic rape should also be part of genocide. In other words, that genocide includes rape of that kind. I mean, not incidental rape, but rape that's used for the purpose of destroying a group. So, the definitions and the way people think about genocide evolve over time, but the fundamental definition is the one I gave you.
Now, would that include eliminating a particular ethnicity's language as opposed to killing or raping? Would that definition fit there?
No. So actually, on purpose, and when I say on purpose, in the legislation that led up to the Genocide Convention, there was a discussion of what we would call now cultural genocide. Okay? And cultural genocide, which means the destruction of language, artifacts, history books, all this kind of thing, which go into the genocidal process. They're part of the genocidal process, but do not in and of themselves constitute genocide. Now, one of the things that does in the Genocide Convention is the forced transfer, for example, of children. Into other families and forced taking away of children from peoples. So things like what happens to indigenous people or happened to indigenous people in Canada, for example, is considered a genocide. But just, forcing people not to use their language in and of itself is not genocide. You need to destroy the group, as a group, and the group can continue to be a group even speaking a different language. For example, a good example is Ukrainians, who many of whom is mother tongue and tongue at home was, maybe not anymore, but was Russian, right? Because there was a lot of forced assimilation of Ukrainians in the history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. So, but that would not be considered a genocidal act.
Interesting. So, given what you've seen at Bucha, coupled with the reports you've seen with these filtration camps at Taganrog, I think just north of the Crimea, where does this act or this situation fit on the call it genocide scale?
Okay, so I think it's useful if it's okay for me to broaden that question a little bit. I mean, first of all, of course, Bucha is not the only place where there were, atrocities carried out, and they're still finding people, and we're learning about this day by day. And by the way, the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court has already said it's collecting evidence on war crimes. They're already collecting stuff in Ukraine itself. There are centers collecting material there. People in the State Department are collecting stuff. People in the European Union, in Brussels are collecting stuff. So people are collecting evidence. And the evidence is crucial because, for an historian, again, you can call something genocide. But to be tried in a court for genocide is a different question. And you have to have a certain kind of evidence. I mean, historians need evidence too. But so the evidence is not in yet. But let me just mention the fact that there are 4 different kinds of international crimes that we're talking about that are going on or could be going on in Ukraine. One is genocide, and we've just talked about that and about its definition. Then there are war crimes. And war crimes are things like, shooting artillery into civilian buildings without any purpose. That's a war crime. So when people call Putin a war criminal, they're absolutely right. Right? I mean, war crimes are being committed. I mean, civilians, innocent civilians with there's no way that they could be threatening the Russian troops are being killed. Right? That's a war crime. Then there are crimes against humanity. That's another category of these 4 international crimes. And by the way, people will differ on the hierarchy of these crimes. I mean, some people will say genocide is the crime of crimes, the worst of these crimes. Other people will argue, no, that these are all more or less equal kinds of crimes, but let's just leave that for a while. So they're crimes against humanity. That includes things like depriving people of food purposely, which, has taken place. Torture, I mean, the kinds of things that are going on in Mariupol, for example, can be considered, war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then other things, massacres and stuff like that. And abuse of people, in war when there's no, reason for it, no justification for it. Those are crimes against humanity. And then the fourth one, which is not talked about enough, is the war of aggression. So, for example, the Nazis at Nuremberg in 1946 were primarily tried for war against aggression. A war of aggression. In other words, they committed aggression against a country which wasn't doing anything to them. And this wasn't just a border war. Sometimes you're allowed to have border wars, if there are claims about the borders and stuff like that. But to take over a whole country, the way the Nazis did, Poland, and then to attack the Soviet Union, that was considered a war, or in Western Europe, against Belgium and France, that's considered a war of aggression. And that is an international crime. And that was the crime, by the way, for which the Nazis were hanged, right, at Nuremberg. Not necessarily killing the Jews. I mean, that was not a big part of the agenda. The big part of the agenda was the war of aggression. So in all four of those cases, then you have, evidence that the Russians have committed a war of aggression, that they're committing war crimes, that it's likely they're committing crimes against humanity, and we don't know about genocide. We just don't know about genocide. We don't know about the intention. We don't know what's going on exactly in Taganrog. I mean, it would be very scary, if, they were taking out people and shooting. That would be genocide, but we don't know what they're doing exactly. It's a little bit like, Xinjiang, and the Uyghurs. I mean, we don't know exactly what's happening. And so, you just have to kind of wait, unfortunately, on that. Now, part of the problem, you said you didn't mind if I carried on a little bit, so I'm going to...
Not at all. That's why we're here. That's why we're here.
Carry on a little bit. It's like the old days lecturing, right? Part of the problem here is that some of the documents we're seeing are looking more and more genocidal. So 2 or 3 days ago, there was a document that came out from Novosti. I don't know if you saw it, a press agency written by a journalist whose name I'm not going to remember. But Novosti is a semi-official press agency. And this was a genocidal document. And by that, it said, the problem is not just a few Ukrainians at the top that we have to denazify. Ukrainians are Nazis.
They're corrupted.
They have to be eliminated. I mean, it's sort of an eliminationist document. And you read that thing, and it's really, really scary in terms of how it's portraying this whole, distorted issue of Nazis at the top of the neo-Nazis at the top of the Ukrainian government. In this case, the guy is saying essentially any Ukrainian patriot, is a neo-Nazi because he's she is anti-Russian. And so you get this really horrible rhetoric. I mean, Putin himself had some, pretty disgusting historical documents which he had released, and then some of these speeches that we mentioned before, which had some really bad kind of history in it. But this was not about history. This was about, what are we going to do when we win this war? And it was not just ugly, but like I said, genocidal, meaning in some ways calling for the death of Ukrainians. And so that was really disturbing to me. And that came out roughly the same time as the Bucha massacres were revealed, and the killings were revealed in Bucha. And, putting those things together is not a pretty picture, and one that one needs to worry about, I think. I don't know what we can do about it, except to sort of do what we're doing, which is to scream and yell and kick up a fuss and, sanctions and all this other kinds of things. But it's worrying. It's disturbing.
Now, it's obvious what the Ukrainians think about going back to Russia or being a part of Russia based on their fierce resistance. Going into this and looking through the lens of the Russian historical experience, and again, it's going to be hard and difficult to put yourself into Putin's head. But just what's the kind of the Russian psyche from that historical experience? How do they think and consider the Ukrainians and their worldview?
Okay, we have to probably be a little bit careful, when saying the Russians, because there are lots of Russians.
Yep.
And, I'm particularly disturbed. I mean, I have friends both in Russia and in Ukraine. And my friends in Russia are just as shocked and disturbed and upset and feeling helpless as I do about this war. So it's not all Russians, right? But the Russian leadership, right. and certainly, a significant part of the population, I think it's overestimated how many, but still a significant part of the population supports Putin and his view. And his view essentially is that Ukrainians are not a separate people. They're not a distinct people. They're just Russians warmed over. This historical document that I mentioned, that the big one, the 6,000 or 7,000 word screed that he wrote in July, long before the invasion, and whether he wrote it or not is another question, but certainly, his team of his historians wrote it. Basically came up with a kind of view of Russian and Ukrainian history, which eliminated one very important strand, which is Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian feelings of distinctiveness as a nation and history of distinctiveness as a nation going back to the 10th century. So in doing that, Putin, I should say, was not unique. That is to say, the Ukrainians have faced, Russian ideas about their insignificance and their lack of distinctiveness from Russians, going, back, really to the 19th century. I won't go back beyond that, but there was, the Tsars. When the Ukrainians were under the Tsars, in the 1840s and 50s, especially 60s. I mean, Ukrainians were basically told they're not a separate people. They're not allowed to speak their language. They're not allowed to, publish in Ukrainian. And Ukrainian intellectuals who believed in the separate, in some of the separate distinctiveness of the Ukrainian nation, were forced abroad. And they were abroad in the sense as they went across the border into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where there was a large Ukrainian population as well, and who then continued to develop these ideas themselves. And all of this is denied by Putin's screed. I mean, he basically says, they're Belarusians. He does recognize there are these three pieces to the East Slavic, group: Belarusians, Little Russians, meaning Ukrainians, and Great Russians, meaning the Russians that we talked about. But they're all Russians, right? They're all Russians. And they all belong together in something he calls the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And this Russian world are all Russians. And this Russianness is something Ukrainians share. And from the point of view, again, of this screed, what's happened is that this, this neo-Nazi, group supported by the United States, in fact, egged on and even instigated in some ways by the United States and the West, is trying to undermine Russia And he calls them a kind of anti-Russia. Ukraine is anti-Russia, is what this document says. The way it's now shaped. And in fact, it's just Russia warmed over. And so, the idea then is to get, supposedly, the idea then is to get rid of this neo-Nazi, my lights have gone off. I'm going to turn them on a bit. To get rid of this neo-Nazi clique, and in that way counter the Americans, counter the West, and bring this into its justifiable whole. Now that's the official screed, right? That's the official line, and is the backdrop of the invasion. And I even have colleagues. I confess to you that I did not see this invasion coming, even when the troops were massed on the border. But I have colleagues, who did, and who said that those historical ideas made it clear that he was going to take over Ukraine. I'm not so sure of that. In retrospect, they're right, and I was wrong, right? But I'm not so sure you could have read it then. And of course, the Ukrainians didn't think they were going to invade. Most Russians that I know didn't think he was going to invade. And the American government, even though warning, obviously, of the invasion, a potential invasion, I don't think was really ready either for February 24th when it happened. So that's the official backdrop. The real reasons are deeper, and go to Russian ideas of their power, of this Russian world, but also its actual geopolitical power. And in that sense, Ukraine is central to how Putin and the Russian elite now, but also in the past, thinks about empire. So we're not talking so much about recreation of Soviet Union, by the way. Putin, I don't think he liked the Soviet Union on one level very much. But the Russian Empire is another story. His heroes, Peter the Great, not necessarily Stalin, as some people might think. Peter the Great and Catherine at the end of the 18th century built the Russian Empire, this powerful, geopolitical entity that controlled, Eurasian continent, basically. With these 14 time zones and all that kind of thing, going from north to the Arctic, south, and so on, to Persia. And this giant geopolitical entity depends, from Moscow, from Putin's point of view, on Ukraine. Otherwise, you're a little regional power, which is what Obama called them. And what we're dealing with now, a little regional power with nukes. And we can see how that can destroy
the largest nuclear power on the planet.
Right. So it's both kind of ideological, how people think in Moscow, and it's very important. You can't eliminate, that backdrop, that way of looking at the world, but it's also fiercely geopolitical, meaning, power and the ability to exert power depends on Russia controlling Ukraine and Belarus too.
Now, going back to Bucha and the atrocities that we've seen there, I know it's very early days, so it's hard to assess whether or not the orders to do that were just local, soldiers just being frustrated with Russian military performance, or if there was actually something that came from the top down. Given the Russian historical experience, how has that trended in the past? Is that something that sporadically happened at a grassroots level, or was it kind of more weighted toward this, kind of in Stalin's world with the NKVD kind of carrying out execution orders, things like that?
It's a good question and, not an easy one to answer. I mean, there is, I think, as you probably know, a kind of Russian way of war. And that Russian way of war, tends to emphasize, artillery, pounding people. There's a German way of war, which is, you also pound people, but it's a different kind of, it's a different kind of destruction in mind.
Yeah, well, it's
But
also the U.S. military actually lifted great portions of it in its air-land battle doctrine. So the concept of Auftragstaktik, right, which is mission-oriented tactics. But go on, sorry, I wanted to throw that in there.
So anyway, I mean, there's a Russian way of war, and we saw it in the Second World War, and we saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in, Chechnya. We saw it in Georgia really quickly in 2008, and we saw it in Syria, So there's a lot of pounding the hell out of civilians. And unfortunately, that's part of the deal when the Russians go to war, and they don't pay a lot of attention to, casualties that may not be necessary, to the strategic objective. And that is just part of a kind of tradition of using artillery, tanks, and a certain kind of warfare that characterizes their military in general, I think. And the other thing to say is, I spent a lot of time. This is a different issue, but it's not completely unrelated. I spent a lot of time working on the problem at the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the peace of rape by Soviet soldiers of predominantly German women. And it was extremely widespread and really quite horrible. So then the question always arises in that case, well, was this on purpose? Did they rape these women as part of warfare? And we had this question, by the way, in Bosnia too. Did the Serbs rape Bosnian Muslim women as part of a campaign, a genocidal campaign? All these questions are a little bit different. So maybe I should leave the Yugoslav one out of it, or the Rwanda one out of it. But in the case of the Soviets after the Second World War, I'm more or less convinced that this was just something that was tolerated by the officers, but not ordered by them. And that it didn't come from the top, but the top wasn't going to deal with the issue at all. In fact, as Stalin would say, kind of dismissively to some people, well, boys will be boys, and these are soldiers of war, and this sort of thing this sort of thing is going to happen. Did he order it? No. Clearly, NKVD people were out there shooting people, who were seen as enemies. So you have probably two things at once. I mean, now that you mentioned this question, and I really hadn't thought about it this way, I think probably two things at once are going on. One of the things that's going on is they are chasing down alleged enemies and shooting. I think that's probably unquestionably true. And, we have reports at checkpoints, of people's arms being checked for tattoos because they think they're Nazis, and Nazis are going to have, like the SS, a tattoo on their arm. So they're checking people for tattoos. But they also certainly have their lists, of people who are designated enemies, and they're shooting. I think this is, something they're doing. And there is, they are fighting some quite virulently anti-Russian people, who, they certainly know about. And if they capture them, they're going to kill them. Or at least send them off to Russia, into some kind of prison. So that's going on. But my hunch is, and I don't really know, and I haven't seen the evidence, so I have to be careful. But my hunch is that most of what we see on our screens, is in some ways inadvertent or just, casual brutality and barbarity. There was one, I think a drone took a picture of a tank, shooting a guy on a bicycle. I mean, come on. That's what that is. And the commanders, don't order it. But that's what men at war do, and women sometimes too. And it's just one of those things where they're not trained in such a way that this becomes somehow prohibited. I know we try in our military, you know more about this than I do, as hard as we can, to train our soldiers not to shoot a civilian riding around on a bicycle, with a bag of groceries. I mean, the other thing to say, I mean, and I don't want to use the word to be fair, because there's nothing fair in this situation. I mean, it's Russians invading and then pounding Ukrainians. I mean, they did this. Ukrainians have said, we will fight to the last person. We will fight. Men, women, and children will fight. Old people will fight. All of us are going to fight. People are taking shots at Russians, I'm sure, from rooftops, maybe even from bicycles too, going by on a bicycle and shooting a Russian soldier. So for the Russian soldiers who may have seen a pal get shot, or who, may themselves have been shot at from a rooftop, or from some old woman who threw a Molotov cocktail at his tank, which is conceivable, right? I mean, the Ukrainians have called for, a war of the people against the Russian soldiers. For the Russian soldiers, this may be something that they just, are reacting to themselves, and just shooting people who are potential people who will shoot at them or who will throw Molotov cocktails at them.
Well, it's like the Lieutenant Calley
Civil War, that breeds this kind of violence. So I'm sorry to go on.
It was like the Lieutenant Calley experience, right, in Vietnam, right, where they went to clear a village, and because there were snipers and they could never find the sniper, and then they kept coming back, and not to excuse it, and certainly not to excuse this scenario, but those things do happen in war. There's another narrative too that I don't think happened in Bucha, but there's also the reaction that a populace has on collaborators, right? So, anecdotally, I have a friend who was also a Stanford grad, was ethnic Ukrainian, married a native Ukrainian, and we're going to move to the United States, or we're going to buy a house in Ukraine. And he'd lived there for 10 years, and they were looking at Bucha. And his potential future neighbor was found hanged. And it had come out that he was a Russian collaborator. Now, did he kill himself? Maybe. But there's also that experience, and nobody in the media seems to be asking that question, because it would be, frankly, insensitive to ask it. Right. But these things are never clean.
That's right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. And we'll find that Ukrainians are committing atrocities as well against Russians. I mean, there was, there have been reports of Ukrainians shooting Russian prisoners and stuff like that. And, who can be surprised about that, and torturing. So, it's, the idea is to avoid war. I mean, when my work on genocide, has really, to me, made clear that genocide is something that, comes with war. I mean, it comes with war, and not always in, a huge, in kind of major proportions, but it's, war breeds genocide. War bleeds into genocide. And, that's why it's really important to avoid war. But, we have a case here where it's happened, and, all we can do is try to be vigilant. And, again, there are good guys and bad guys in this fight. It's quite clear. We can't ignore the fact that, the Russians not only started it, but instigated the whole thing. The Ukrainians want no part of this. They want no part of this. And now that they're in it, they're going to do some things that are not acceptable too. That's inevitable.
Now, in the kind of Russian-Ukrainian historical experience with these sort of, I don't want to say genocidal tendencies, that was kind of the first thought I had, but let's talk a little about the Holodemour, or Holodemour. I'm probably butchering it. How do Ukrainians, or at least the Ukrainian historical narrative, what's that versus what the Russian historical narrative? And by that specifically, I mean, is it blamed kind of on Stalin? Is kind of a Stalin thing, or is it blamed on Russia? Right? Was it a kind of a Russian thing from the Ukrainian perspective?
I mean, those are great questions. And those are the questions which, historians grapple with, the Ukrainians grapple with. I mean, I should mention I'm on an academic board of a new Holodemour museum that, is partly built in Kiev. And, I assume will be finished at some point. I mean, that part of it's already there, but this is a new kind of building. And we talk a lot about, historical background, what kind of things you show, what's necessary to talk about. And there's some disagreement. Many Ukrainian historians now are and then there's a kind of split. I don't know what this will look like after the war. I mean, we can talk about this. Things are changing, in Ukraine right now. But this is before February 24th, right? That I'm talking about. There's a kind of split between those Ukrainian historians, and the split, is not quite so severe in the West, but still there are different emphases in how people go about looking at it. And the split is essentially between people who believe that the Holodomor, which is, we should explain to your audience, I'm sure not everybody knows, was the kind of terror famine, a genocidal famine of 32, 33. There was famine throughout the Soviet Union, but in Ukraine it was worse, and something like 4 million people died in that famine. 4 million Ukrainians died in that famine. The numbers are also contested, I should say. Some Ukrainian historians now are saying it's 11 million, which is just a huge number. And, they're doing demographic work and other kinds of work. I mean, these are very legitimate people who are doing this work. But the rest of us still think 4 million is the right number. But, it's hard to know. These things are really hard to know, and all these numbers, need to be subjected to historical, periodic historical and demographic examination. Anyway, long and short of it is, Ukrainians consider it a genocide. I consider it a genocide. Some of my colleagues, and when I say genocide, I mean a purposeful attempt to break the back of the Ukrainian nation, as such, as I explained in the definition earlier. Some of my colleagues in the Soviet history field do not think it's genocide. They think there was, famine all over, and this may have been a little bit worse, but that's because Ukraine was a little more agricultural, and that Stalin was just being Stalin, right? He was trying to collectivize everybody's agriculture and stealing grain from everybody. And I think that's wrong. I think it was a much more serious and purposeful attempt, to attack Ukrainians as Ukrainians in the Ukrainian Republic. And there's evidence for that. I won't go into the whole set of arguments. So the question you asked, was it Stalin or is it something deeper, is also a hard one. Because anti-Ukrainian actions on the part of the Russian government go back. And there was famine in Ukraine in the beginning of the 1920s. In fact, some people will say this famine that came in the early 1930s, was just another episode in the Soviet system trying to get the Ukrainians and try to put them in their place. And by the way, putting them in their place means denying them of their nationality and their ability to be distinct. And if you deny people their ability to be Ukrainians, and this is not just language, this is all kinds of things, and killing them in large numbers, then that's genocide. So some people will date it back. Some people will say, I have colleagues who basically say, Russians have been out to get rid of Ukrainians from the very beginning. And when, beginning is a hard one to talk about when that is again, but let's go back to the 19th century, again, where there was this notion that we are all Russians and that any attempt, to institute Ukrainian distinctiveness was to be crushed, and sometimes physically crushed, deported, killed, that sort of thing, repressed. So it's a hard question. I mean, in my view, and again, I underline my, because historians will disagree. I mean, you know this as well as I do. Less about the facts of what happened than about how you interpret them. In my view, this was more Stalin in 1932-33. This was more the Soviet system. This was more about, the kind of fierce centralization motif, and within that, anti-Ukrainian views of Stalin and the Soviet leadership. In other words, they looked at the Ukrainians as inherently anti-Soviet. And in some ways, they were right.
Yeah.
These Ukrainian peasants just didn't want to go into the collective farms. They fought like the Dickens, against, there were outright battles in the countryside all over Ukraine. They fought like the Dickens, not to have to go into a collective farm. They were, and they were deported. I mean, Ukrainian kulaks, or kurkuls, as they're called in Ukrainian, were deported in hundreds of thousands, many of them shot, for their supposed, class basis as exploiters of labor. But in point of fact, they were shot because they were Ukrainians who didn't want to, deal with the Soviet system, or deported and eventually died in the Gulag, a lot of them. So, and the Ukrainian countryside then that starved, right? And this was especially bad in the winter of 32-33, being deprived of grain. I mean, they starved not because there was a bad harvest, but because the Soviets kept insisting on requisitioning grain from them. And there were a series of these requisition campaigns where, these thugs and party people, and sometimes poor peasants, and sometimes people from the cities would go into out into the collective farms, and they would just, grab everything that was there. They'd open the larder and take it all. And there was nothing to eat. And the people died, again, by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, just lying out on the fields, hungry. And there was enough grain in the Soviet Union to feed them. So that kind of attack on the Ukrainians, I think, is genocide. And comes from Moscow. But less from kind of Russians, at least in my view. This is going to be now, now we have an example, of anti-Ukrainian activity on the part of the Russian government, which has nothing to do with Stalin, right? I mean, and communism. But in my view, what happened in 32-33 is not just one more episode, of anti-Ukrainian activity on the part of Moscow. Although it is that, right? I'm not saying it's not that, but it's special because of the whole Stalin centralization, collectivization motif from the early 1930s.
So again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but one way it seems you could kind of summarize it is, while all the characteristics of Stalin's plan seem to be from a different source, i.e. collectivization, etc., the eagerness by which some of his willing executioners executed it may have derived from that historical separateness that Russian, again, I'm trying not to overgeneralize, but that sense of separateness that was in this kind of collective psyche of some Russian people.
Right. That they just didn't like the fact that Ukrainians were trying to be Ukrainians and being different. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that they wanted their own form of, political and social organization, just like they do now.
Now, this is a bit of
it's part of a longer story, but the longer story doesn't explain it. I guess that's what I want to say. And I'm still, you think about I worked on it. I'll probably work on it again, but you're still trying to get the right balance, and it's hard. But I think the people on the other, like I said, I have colleagues, very good ones, who believe this was not genocide and this was not to get Ukrainians at all. And there, I think they're wrong. And so I'm on the kind of the Ukrainian side of the argument, but not full. Where I think that the Russians are sort of always out to get Ukrainians, and the Russians are, deeply antagonistic to all Ukrainians, and so on and so forth. So that's not quite, so both stories, have to be balanced somehow appropriately.
Now, I'm going to go kind of take a little an aside, just so that people understand, how bad was the Holodomor? In other words, were there signs of, did people have to resort to cannibalism? Did they, just to give a sense of the scope, because that is something that certainly scarred the Ukrainian mindset.
Absolutely. It's it's a gash in Ukrainian history. I mean, it's fierce and awful and as bad as you can imagine. And by that, I mean, there was widespread cannibalism, which was known, in Moscow. They knew this was happening. There's something called necrophagy, which is basically, digging up corpses that are buried and eating them. People were wild, mad, driven crazy by hunger. So they would eat their own kids sometimes. Kill and eat.
Like their dead children or actually kill their children?
Kill and eat, And it was terrible. It was really, really terrible. A colleague of mine, a famous historian named Robert Conquest, who was at the Hoover Institution for many years and has now passed away, wrote in his book about the Holodomor that this was one vast Belsen, bodies everywhere, just scattered.
I.e., like the concentration camp Belsen.
Yeah, the concentration camp. Yeah, just bodies, hunger, killing people. And by the way, as long as we're going to talk about Holodomor, there was a number of things about it that made it special in terms of the famine around the country. First of all, Ukrainians were not allowed to leave their villages. They couldn't go find food elsewhere. They couldn't go to the cities. I mean, some did make it to the cities, and we've got photographs, of bodies scattered, on the streets of Kharkiv and Kiev. People who make it to the cities, but they don't get enough food and they just die on the streets. They're not allowed to leave Ukraine. So there's more food elsewhere. So if they could have gotten to Belarus, then the Belarusian Republic, right? If they could have gotten there was food. If they could have gotten to Russia, there was food. But they wouldn't let them get on the trains. They wouldn't let them go. There were guard posts on the highways, that people couldn't leave. So they were stuck in a place where then they were deprived of food, and then these requisition people came in to get the last stuff. So it was really, I mean, it was hell, right? And people have written about it. There were, some people managed to survive and have written memoirs about it. We have, descriptions from various journalists who managed to get to the countryside and have told, what the story was. There were journalists, by the way, who also told the Soviet line and basically said nothing was going wrong. But that's the famous Walter Duranty of the New York Times. I remember that.
Oh, I'm definitely aware of him. Yeah,
that character, who got a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from Russia. Well, from Soviet Union. They tried to take away his Pulitzer Prize, but I don't know if they actually did or not. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, your worst imagination is there. It was just a terrible, terrible scene, and you just feel for the Ukrainians. And by the way, this had effects, as every genocide does on survivor generations. It has psychological effects. There were a lot of physical effects. A lot of people were never the same after this. You say 4 million died, but think of all those people who came close to dying and managed to survive, and children whose brains were development was injured and all that kind of stuff. No, and then the long-term kind of psychological effects on Ukrainian nation. The fact that they went through this genocide in this way, and we know that these genocides have long-term psychological effects on multiple generations as you go through it. There are organizations who still are dealing with this, with survivors, as it were, of a Holodomor, just as there were with the Holocaust and with Rwanda and Bosnia and all these things. Don't disappear just because the event goes. So in this case, the Holodomor, just because it ceased to be in 1933, 34, the famine sort of came to an end. Soviets decided to deal with the countryside a little bit differently. They also killed a lot of people. And by the way, I should have mentioned when talking about genocide, they didn't just kill, not just peasants died, right? I mean, they actually took out and shot a lot of people. And the Ukrainians during the purges, let me get my light again. The Ukrainians during the purges, suffered terribly, disproportionately. And, the whole Ukrainian Communist Party was, everything. They wiped out the Ukrainian elite, school teachers, and lawyers, and this kind of thing. So it was not just an attack on the countryside. The attack on the countryside was really incredibly brutal.
Let me ask two last questions, because I know we're kind of running close to time here.
Yeah.
The first question is we had the Holodomor, and then about 8 years later, the Germans came in, and in most historical accounts, the Ukrainians welcomed them with open arms for obvious reasons. And even today, there are allegations that members of the Azov battalion have kind of these Nazi tendencies. What was the Ukrainian experience during German occupation, and how did the Russians react once they kind of re-seized control of Ukrainian territory?
Ooh, that's a big story. It's a really big story, and I can recommend you a couple of good books if you're interested. But let me try to do this in as brief a fashion or as succinct a fashion as possible. First of all, there are different Ukraines to think about when you think about World War II, especially. There's Western Ukraine. Today, place like Lviv and so on. These are in Western Ukraine. They were part of Poland. Western Ukraine was part of Poland before the Second World War. So Western Ukraine had we're not under the Soviet Union. Okay? Central and Eastern Ukraine were the main republic, the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union. So Kiev, a lot of these places were in Soviet Ukraine. Those two parts of Ukraine reacted differently to the Nazis and the Soviets in general. Again, there are exceptions, right? There are always exceptions. You can't say the Ukrainians any more than today, as I'm saying, you can say the Russians. So Western Ukraine was forcibly incorporated. Oh boy, it's just not easy to make these history lessons simple.
Yeah, and you don't have a lot of time too, so we just need to make sure that the audience understands that you don't have enough time to elaborate in a nuanced fashion.
Right. Okay, yeah, that's why you asked me why I don't go on the news. This is why I don't go on the news. I mean, I just assume to have a student in my office talking about this than anything. Okay, so Western Ukrainians, generally, because of their antipathy to being absorbed into the Soviet Union, 39-41 under the Nazi-Soviet Pact, tended to support the Nazis. So when the Nazis then came back in and liberated them from being in the Soviet Union, it was perfectly natural for them to welcome the the Germans in. Right. Many fought with the Germans. They had their own army, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who initially fought with the Nazis.
Is this Stephen Bander or
yes.
Okay.
I mean, he's one part of a larger panoply of groups. They're different groups in UPA, which is the Ukrainian Insurrection Army, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this was Bandera. And they fought against the Soviets. Yes, with the Nazis, right? But then when the Nazis refused to give them a separate Ukraine, which is what they were fighting for. I mean, they weren't fighting necessarily because they, liked Nazis or hated Jews. They fought because they wanted their own country, right? Which is what Ukrainians wanted. So anyway, they fought. And then once the Nazis said no, 42, 43, they switched sides and they started to fight against the Nazis. But also they didn't like the Soviets, given what the Soviets had done. So they were still going to fight against the Soviets. All right, so Ukraine, but the mass of Ukrainians, the main point is the mass of Ukrainians, fought with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. So the mass of Ukrainians were not collaborators. The mass of Ukrainians suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis. I mean, Nazi occupation of Kiev was horrible. I mean, it was horrible. Depriving them of food, treating them like Untermenschen, putting them in camps, forcing them into labor battalions, sending them to the Reich to work forcibly sending them to the Reich to work in German factories towards the end of the war, especially. And, so the mass of Ukrainians were not Nazi sympathizers at all. They fought with the Soviets, and there are lots of Ukrainians who died as heroes of the Soviet Union. There must be tens of thousands, who died fighting against the Nazis. Now, in the western part, many of these UPA groups continued to fight against the Soviets. I mean, they didn't really, because the Soviets took over then Western Ukraine. The part that the Nazis had taken over, now the Soviets took over. I mean, initially it's Soviets, then Nazis, then Soviets. And now when the Soviets came back, no more Poland. This territory was taken away from Poland in the Second World War and compensated with German territory. When the Soviets came back, then people were upset in the western part, especially in Western Ukraine. Not so much in Eastern Ukraine. They just wanted peace and to be done with this, horrible war, which was horrible for them. It was a really a war that killed millions of Ukrainians, right? Not to mention Jews. Right? So, that's all part of that story. Now, if you take post-1991 Ukraine, some of that anti-Soviet, anti-Russian sentiment on the part of groups of Ukrainians, especially in Western Ukraine, reemerged. And, it's powerful. It's out there. Some of these, groups can be accused of being neo-Nazis, right? Some of them, were and are anti-Semitic. But on the whole, we're talking about fringe groups.
Right.
Talking about, people, after all, the neo-Nazis in Germany, and we have neo-Nazis in this country,
Right. Yeah, they're everywhere. They're everywhere.
I honestly don't think, Ukraine is sort of beset at all by these groups. But they're there, and, they're in paramilitary formations, and right now they're fighting like the Dickens against the Russians. And, we don't talk about this a lot. I don't like talking about it because Ukrainians, again, are getting pummeled by the Russians, and it's not fair. It's not just. And so, but it is true that once this war is over, and hopefully the Ukrainians win, there's going to be, and even Zelensky has said this in an interview, maybe we can conclude here or close to here, but I'll leave that to you. I mean, Zelensky has said himself, the Russian-Ukrainian relations, are marred forever by this war. because the kind of anti-Russian feelings, the kind of deep Ukrainian nationalist anti-Russian sentiments, have been exacerbated by this war. And, whereas before the war, there was a lot of hybridity, a lot of mixing, a lot of mixed families, a lot of people spoke Ukrainian and Russian, and didn't mind switching back and forth, which, by the way, Zelensky can do now, and we've seen him do it. After the war, this is going to be different. Russians, even the Russians who are good now, Ukrainian patriots, are starting to study Ukrainian much more seriously and stop speaking Russian. So there's a kind of unfortunate, sad in some ways, unmixing of peoples, which, is not going to serve either group of people well. It's always a good thing in my view, to have this kind of hybridity, to have this kind of ability to operate in multiple cultures, to have appreciation for other cultures. Many Ukrainians, knew Pushkin, as well as they knew their poets. And, that's going to be gone. That's going to be gone once this war is over because of this, hatred that has been brought about. And that's exactly what Zelensky said. This was his point, giving an interview to 4 or 5 Russian journalists a few weeks ago. Not a few weeks ago, it was last week, I think.
So, Dr. Naimark, you actually answered my second question, but I was going to ask if there was any hope for any sort of reconciliation.
I'll answer all your questions and more, probably.
So it sounds like there's going to be some period of this decoupling, even if this thing were to resolve relatively shortly. So I want to thank you very much for your time and the opportunity to even get a tiny glimmer of your vast scholarship on this particular topic. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hopefully talking with you at some point in the future, even offline. So I appreciate your time.
Good to see you. And thank you for getting in touch. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you again.
Former students.
Yeah. And I have lots of great memories of you. So hopefully I can continue making them.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.